Fatigue is one of the most common symptoms after sustaining a concussion. My name is Dr. Paul Hrkal, and I want to tell you a little bit about why this is the case, and more importantly, what you can do about it. So, one of the most common symptoms is fatigue, along with another huge factor, sleep, that can influence fatigue. Now, it's not the only symptom. There's lots you can see here. This is right from the CDC website. In the emotional realm, cognitive dysfunction, dizziness, you have light sensitivity, even vomiting. And so this can happen immediately after concussion. And there's a reason why this is taking place. So sleep is a massive issue. We know that a large percentage of people that suffer from a concussion do have some sort of sleep dysfunction that occurs very quickly right after sustaining it. But if you look at the actual cellular level, just really quickly, just to give you a tour of what's happening inside your brain after you get a concussion, you have damage that's occurring to your actual neurons. This is a diagram of a neuron, and the axon is this little thing that's connecting the two parts of the neuron, this long component. There's also inflammation that happens right away. And when your body's under inflammation or in an inflammatory state, you are going to automatically have more fatigue because of the changes that it does to certain areas of your brain and this really important area called the mitochondria. Now, you might have heard of this term called mitochondria. Each one of your cells have many mitochondria that produce energy, and the disruption that happens after concussion because of the inflammation, but also because of the nerve chemical balance, this is called excitotoxicity. This leads to the impairment of the mitochondria, and ultimately the cells try to compensate and they ultimately fail, and they get to the point that they actually can't produce enough energy and can't protect themselves and ultimately lead to damage. And all of this is what leads to symptoms. And so really, to understand fatigue that happens right after concussion, you really have to understand this mitochondria. This is a 3D little diagram. And normally when they're happy and you're at rest and you're healthy, they're producing this thing called ATP, and that's your energy currency inside of your body. You need oxygen for this to be made. You also need fuel for this to be made. And there are certain nutrient cofactors like magnesium, B vitamins, iron, thyroid hormone, and a number of other ones that are really important for allowing this energy cascade or pathway to actually occur. So you can see that this is what a happy mitochondria looks like. But unfortunately, after a concussion, there is a change in blood flow. So you have a lack of oxygen. There is possibly a change in fuel. A person not so much feeding themselves, but because the mitochondria are under more inflammation and damage from excitotoxicity, you may not be as efficient at using some of these fuels. There are certain nutrient deficiencies that can happen. We know, for example, magnesium levels drop dramatically after sustaining concussion. This might also contribute to mitochondrial dysfunction. And even other things like infections, such as bacterial or more common viral infections. Anybody that's suffering from post-concussion issues, persistent symptoms, knows that their symptoms almost always get worse after getting a viral infection. So our mitochondria are very sensitive to immune challenges. And then other types of inflammation. This can be excitotoxicity or just other more generic type of inflammation that's related to our environment, our food, and a number of other things such as autoimmune conditions. And then finally, hormonal imbalances. Now, the reason I'm including these last two here is because when you do sustain a concussion, you can sometimes get hormonal changes that drop right away, and that can further contribute this. So basically, all these things conspired so you don't produce as much ATP. Now, in the short term, this actually can be beneficial because it kind of forces you to rest. And so there's a fine balance between resting after a concussion, but not resting too much that you stay in a dark room and get more symptoms. So the most common and the most evidence-based recommendations now are that you get up and you start doing some things after about 24 hours within your capacity. And this actually starts preserving the mitochondria that you have and producing more ATP. The catch is that when you do nothing, you lose your mitochondrial energy production. And when you exercise, even though it's an investment in energy, you do actually increase your mitochondrial number and also function. So you actually get more of this ATP. What about people that have persistent symptoms? So these are people that have symptoms for longer than 30 days, and they also can have fatigue. So there's a number of factors that may be contributing to this. We're not going to go over each one, but just wanted to show you that there's some things that we just talked about that are present on this list. For example, blood flow changes, also persistent inflammation, tissue damage of the neck. Your sensory systems are dysfunctional. These are all some of the underlying reasons for persistent symptoms. And so you have to understand that the body sometimes can process all the stimuli, but after a concussion, and this can occur in persistent cases, is that our brain doesn't process these inputs as well. And this, in my clinical experience with my patients, is one of the most common reasons people continue to get symptoms. A good way to think about this is sensory mismatch. So even though that after 30 days, after an acute concussion, your mitochondria might start functioning a little bit better and those initial excitotoxic changes start to fully resolve and go back to baseline, you're still left with symptoms. And that's because the mitochondria may not be properly working and properly fueled. Some of these underlying things like hormonal imbalances are exposed. And then we have this issue where your brain is interpreting all the things that you are seeing, all the ways that you're moving, and the way that you're being balanced. Now that's your visual, vestibular, and neck systems. There's also other things that may come into play, like for example, mood changes and pain. These are all sensory inputs. And so normally when those sensory inputs are smooth and well integrated, you have a normal response to your environment, aka no symptoms. However, the problem is in persistent symptoms, these sensory inputs sometimes can really be magnified, and that ultimately leads to a poor sensory integration, and you have the sensory mismatch, and you have symptoms such as fatigue, brain fog, light and noise sensitivity. So this is why you might walk into a grocery store and all of a sudden be like, oh, I'm so tired and I get light sensitive. This is because your brain is having a sensory mismatch. So what are we going to do about this? Because this is one of the major reasons that you're tired and you have more symptoms after a concussion, and even in persistent cases. So first and foremost, work with a concussion literate provider to get a complete assessment of each one of the systems here that's listed on this slide. Especially your visual system, your neck system, and your vestibular system. So someone like a chiropractor or physiotherapist can help you with that. And someone like a psychotherapist, a psychologist could help you with the mood aspect. And then work with your other healthcare providers, especially your family doctor, to have the sources of your pain assessed. Then you should start asking some questions. What symptoms bring on fatigue? If we go back to the slide, is it after I do an exercise routine? Is it if I use my screens for too long? These are all little cues and signs that might tell you why you're experiencing those symptoms, especially fatigue. So think about what brings on your fatigue and then work backwards from there. Then you can target those particular areas and specific health experts in those areas to help you. For example, if you have a lot of visual symptoms, this might be something that a neuro-optometrist might be helpful with. Or if you have a lot of symptoms after using your neck, after doing any sort of resistance exercise, then you might work with a chiropractor or physiotherapist to assess that. Your vestibular system, you'd be working with a vestibular physiotherapist. Then other things to consider is that if you haven't been doing any exercise for a number of months, some patients even years, you probably are deconditioned, which means that you're out of shape. And that doesn't mean that you gain weight, but also means that from a neurological perspective, your processing is you are out of shape from processing some of this stimuli. And so this is where gradual exposure is helpful, and ultimately working with that concussion literate provider is going to be beneficial. Looking at your sleep is a massive thing that is a huge contributor to energy problems and constantly being tired. If you can't sleep, you can't produce enough ATP, your brain is always going to be running on empty. So getting sleep dysfunction corrected should be a priority. And then from a naturopathic perspective, I start looking at things like blood issues and deficiencies. Iron deficiency is really common. Then I look at particular foods. Or is a person feeling more tired after eating, for example, breads and pastas? A pretty common sign that you might have some wheat sensitivity. And then we look at other hormones like thyroid dysfunction, adrenal dysfunction, testosterone, growth hormone, and then even looking at things like mood. All these things contribute to your ability to produce energy. And ultimately, they all have to be checked off in order for you to get after that root cause. So in conclusion, we do have to kind of work through some of the underlying issues, why you might be fatigued. But just so you understand from this video is that there's an initial cascade that happens in your brain that causes that fatigue. But after those 30 days, you might still be fatigued and left with some of those symptoms like light and noise sensitivity. That's where sensory mismatching comes in. And we want to look at what are some of the things that are leading to that sensory mismatching and causing more symptoms. And one of the best ways to do it is to go through kind of an evidence-based and integrative multidisciplinary approach. So you need multiple providers helping you navigate, first understanding what's happening. So I helped you with that a little bit today. And then looking at your recovery mindset, your nervous system balance, sleep, and then looking at some of the things like deficiencies, hormones, and then finally being ready to tackle things like exercise and neck dysfunction. This is exactly what the Concussion Fix program does. And if you want to click a link in the caption below, you're going to be able to understand a little bit more about how this can help you from the comfort of your own home to start working through some of these underlying issues to help you get after and address the root cause of your fatigue.